Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I'm going live about now. I apologize for not having streamed yesterday because I was really busy and I had the night shift, so I was really tired going into it and out of it. So today we actually have a lot more info to react to. So I'm kind of glad that I skipped yesterday's stream, and I think it will be a great developing story going forward. We have, of course, analyzed everything from A17 Pro, M3 chips on this channel, even going as far back as the M2, which is when this channel really started, and when I went out in the defense for the M2 iPad Pro, and how the M2 chip in general is a worthwhile upgrade. Well, not for M1 owners, of course, but of course that the mere existence of M2 is not some kind of insult. So we have a long history on this channel of reacting to new processor announcements, leaked benchmarks, comparison videos, things like that. Of course, as iPhone 16 hits reviews, we will also react to how real world benchmarks fare, because sometimes early benchmarks can be a little off. We'll see how it performs after a few software updates. So there will be a lot to talk about. And this will be our first topic today, which is that we are now getting first A18 Pro benchmarks, and it's a really fast chip. Now, there are some benchmarks that are somewhat likely to be regular A18 chips, so the non-Pro variant with the cut GPU core count and what Apple called less cache for the CPU, which would explain it being slower in both single and multi-core tasks. That being said, a lot of the regular A18 benchmarks are very much all over the place. So while there is an average that I might be able to find, I think that would be pretty artificial. So we might as well just wait until we have a lot more official stuff. It seems like the A18 Pro interest is in general higher, so the benchmark quality is a lot higher here. So that's what we will be focusing on today. But of course, as regular A18 benchmarks come out, it will be interesting to see how exactly the CPU scales, the GPU scales, the neural engine scales, and then we will react to all of that together. So that's about it for the intro for today's video. As always, please consider subscribing to the channel if you enjoyed the content over here. Like the video, of course, if you enjoyed that too. Comment. I love me a lively live chat. I love interacting with you guys, knowing your opinions, what you agree with me, what you disagree with. Of course, if you have any other suggestions or addendums, sometimes I miss a piece of news that might have come out. And of course, if you want to support this channel directly, please consider leaving a super chat or a super sticker if you can afford a small donation. It's very much appreciated and gets reinvested right back into the channel. And beyond that, if you want to support this channel directly in the long term, you can become a channel member right here on YouTube. Shout out to Fizz, Angelica, and Max Maximus, who are all MarkTech Pro Max tier supporters right here on YouTube. And you can also become a supporter on a Patreon. Link for that is in the description. So let's get started. Now, of course, we don't have a lot of benchmarks yet, especially not really high quality benchmarks, like stuff where I would say like, oh, the device had like a day or two to rest after the latest software install. There are not a ton, like there is control, that there aren't a lot of background processes running, that the device isn't overheating. So of course, any result that we show, even if it's very likely to be true, please still take it with a pinch of salt. Some of it, of course, with much more than that, than just a pinch. So let's see. For one, there are making a comparison now to the M1 MacBook Air or an M1 iPad Pro, however you want to see it, because yes, now in multi-core, the A18 Pro finally beats the late 2020 M1 Apple Silicon processor. So let's see how exactly it all fares here. Now, Benveni and Angelica joining the chat. Angelica wishing us all a lot of fun. Thank you so much. And Benveni saying you got the Pro Max, Desert Titanium, big jump from the 13 Pro. Congratulations, brother. I was thinking of ordering myself a 16 Pro Max, well, just for review purposes. I wasn't going to keep it most likely, but I actually fell asleep super hard after yesterday's night shift, or today's night shift, however you want to define it. And I fully forgot to set myself an alarm just to think about it. And now that I see that most of the orders have been pushed into October, it's actually like, yeah, it makes no sense for me to order anything at this point because, well, right, if I get it like a month later than actual reviewers, that doesn't really make any sense for me. And I also don't want to, well, money's okay. I cannot complain. Like, I don't want to buy a device, potentially break it or whatever, and then not be able to hand it back to Apple. So, but definitely an upgrade from the 13 Pro to the Pro Max. How much storage did you get, Benveni, if you feel like telling us? It's a great upgrade. I myself upgraded from my 13 Pro Max to the 15 Pro Max last year. So, of course, you're getting an even bigger jump in between. And if your 13 Pro is an actual 13 Pro, not a 13 Pro Max, and you just forgot to type in the Max, then you get an even larger upgrade because the battery is disproportionately bigger. The display size increases not just from like 6.1 even to 6.7. Now it's 6.9 inches. The bezels are crazy thin. You get dynamic island now, which of course you didn't have before. So congratulations, Benveni, on your great upgrade path here. But let's get back to the actual benchmarks. Guys, you see, by the way, I love interacting with you in the live chat, so let me know what you think. It's always better that way as a live stream. In terms of single core performance on the A18 Pro, we are now hitting 3,409, and in multi-core, we are now hitting 8,492. Those are basically 18% uplifts across the board versus the 15 Pro Max, which makes a lot of sense given how Apple talks about the uplift between the A17 Pro and the A18 Pro. If it was any more, Apple wouldn't have promised us 15%. They would have promised us like 20 or 25%. So this definitely lines up a lot with Apple's marketing. And it just makes sense when you consider the jump from N3B to N3E and the slightly newer architecture that very much benefits from ARM v9 versus ARM v8 and scalable matrix executions, which have seen the biggest uplift. Now, if we actually go back to Geekbench here and see the latest results. Now, this result is usually closer to like 2,950, at least on my 15 Pro Max. Again, a score below 3,000, definitely going now to a score almost at 3,500. Of course, if you compare it to the much higher clocked M4 in the iPad Pro, that will give you like 3,700, sometimes even 3,800. And then in multi-core result, when we look at the A17 Pro, we get like 7,200. My 15 Pro Max actually gets like 7,400, 7,500. And in comparison, of course, the new one hitting over 8,500, which would put it above the results of an M1 inside the iPad, 3.2 gigahertz. And obviously still a little bit below the M2, which is clocked high. Well, it's not clocked higher than the A18 Pro, but it's clocked higher than the M1. And then the M4 iPad Pro, which is of course our highest performing iOS/iPadOS device. Now, this is the benchmark for the 9-core CPU version, so 3 performance and 6 efficiency cores. If you go for the model with 4 performance cores and 6 efficiency cores, so 10 cores overall, 10 CPU cores overall, then you get like 14,500 here. So definitely still a big leap over the iPhone, but of course that makes sense with the thermal constraints the battery life constraints of the iPhone. Even if Apple said that they did like improve like sustained performance by 20%, that they improved cooling. Of course, the iPad Pro was also advertised as having like 20% better cooling thanks to things like a copper Apple logo. Of course, Apple definitely didn't just use the higher efficiency of N3E. They also made their devices now better at dissipating heat, which will be, of course, very interesting to see exactly how that fares out on the latest iPhones. Benvini saying your 13 Pro is 128 gigabytes and the Pro Max, the new one that you're getting, is 256 gigabytes. That's definitely a very nice upgrade path. I also hear that from a lot of people that in general, they like in the past or even now, they look forward to just buying the cheapest Pro versions. Like I myself, I have a 1 terabyte 15 Pro Max. The reason why I got that is because I originally planned to switch with my cousin. Like I would give her my phone a year later, and she would, because she needs 1 terabyte, she takes an ungodly amount of photos. But then her phone started acting up, so she got herself her own 15 Pro Max. So I myself am now left. I use like 150 gigabytes or something like that of my 1 terabyte. If I would have known, I would have gotten 512. If there would be any storage speed difference, there might be a consideration here, but there is like no software lock different like between 512 and 1 terabyte. Quite honestly, I could get by with 256 probably even. So yeah, I absolutely understand why. And of course, if you have been used to get to using 128 gigabytes, now getting 256. And you also, of course, have now the faster Wi-Fi, the faster 5G. So if you use like cloud storage, in a way, you actually need less storage than ever directly on your device. Thank you, Benvini, for telling us. So those are the CPU benchmarks. They make a lot of sense. Again, like 3400 versus 2900, 8500 versus 72 versus maybe to up to 7500. Then there's also a GPU benchmark that performs at close to 33,000. If we actually compare that to the other metal benchmarks, you will actually find that it's also exceeding the M1 chip, which again, we've talked about that with the multi-core CPU results, and now it does that also for the GPU. Of course, Apple promised us a 17% uplift in memory bandwidth, so that would still put actually, so that would put it very much nicely in line with the memory bandwidth of the M1, but still below the memory bandwidth of the M2 at 100 gigabytes per second. So definitely it makes sense, right? If you follow actually like the rumors, the leaks, if you follow the exact hardware specification, this kind of scaling actually makes sense. Of course, you also have a much newer GPU architecture, and it's hard to see the exact details with something like a Metal Score in Geekbench, which doesn't account for features such as hardware accelerated ray tracing. For example, on the Apple website, Apple actually talks about the A18 Pro doubling the ray tracing performance of the A17 Pro, which strongly suggests that there is actually an upgraded architecture here. With the M4, a lot of us believed that the M4 is basically just a higher clocked M3. And of course, M3 isn't that much more powerful than M2, but it does have hardware accelerated ray tracing, mesh shading, and dynamic cache. But it doesn't actually get more GPU cores, for example, M2 versus M3 versus M4. If you look at A18 Pro and A17 Pro, at least those actually have more GPU cores than if you go back to the A16 and A15. So Apple was a little more aggressive actually with the GPU scaling of the A series chips than they have been thus far with the M series, because obviously Apple is much more price conscious on devices that already have lower more profit margins than the iPhone. So they're looking forward, they're looking to minimize the additional cost that they face by jumping to a new, very expensive node. They don't want to add more cores than necessary, be it CPU or GPU. If they add cores, they are much more willing to now add efficiency cores versus performance cores, because of course they are a lot smaller. They will also impact like heat a lot less, battery life a lot less. In fact, they might even benefit battery life. And if you look at GPU, you can see that Apple wasn't hyper aggressive between M2 and M4. M3 would probably sit somewhere right in the middle. However, you have to account for new features such as ray tracing. And again, those are the kind of tests that are actually they're very silly. Like the Solar Bay benchmark we have on iOS right now doesn't really do a great job in giving us very like advanced and a very advanced understanding of ray tracing capabilities. And it will be a lot better to evaluate once we look at M4 on Macs. And obviously there is no M3 on iOS or iPadOS. So then we will be able to compare apps like Blender that really take advantage of ray tracing capabilities and see if M4 actually scales versus M3 similarly to how A18 Pro is promised to scale versus A17 Pro in terms of ray tracing. So these uplifts that you see here, obviously they're just about GPU compute. You could try to basically say that it's more about rasterization, but even that isn't like a perfect comparison point. And again, if you also try to compare that to Android benchmarks, there is a difference in the API that is utilized here. So I don't like using Geekbench as a GPU test in general. I know a lot of people like on the iOS fanboy side will use it to say, well, you can see A17 Pro gives you like 10,000 more points than the latest Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 in this test. So that explains how it will overperform in games like Genshin Impact. But then I will say like, oh, but look at old tests like GFX Bench. At least that's more directly a graphics test versus like a compute test on Geekbench. But then rightly people will say, well, those old GFX Bench tests are pretty much garbage. They only seem to scale with raw bandwidth, nothing with architecture, barely even with clock speeds. But then of course you have newer tests as well. So it's a mixed bag. Unfortunately, testing cross-platform between like raw capabilities for the GPU is very difficult. Seems to also be pretty difficult, to be honest, when we are talking about the neural engine. Especially with how weird some of the promises now have been from year to year. Like Apple, for example, didn't actually tell us about A18 Pro having more trillion operations per second versus A17 Pro. But when we actually look at benchmarks, and thank you to James Atkinson, a friend of the channel over on Twitter, who I don't know where he actually got those tests. Probably he went deep into the bowels of the Geekbench AI library and saw what the recent tests were there. But when you actually look at it, these are the results for A17 Pro. So 4,000, 23,000, 31,000. And when you actually compare it to the latest iPhone 17.2, which is an iPhone 16 Pro, supposedly, you get like on almost 10% uplift in single precision cores. You get like a 40 to 45% half precision core increase. You get an almost 50% increase in quantized cores, which would be integer 8. And Apple still promises you the same 35 trillion operations per second. So if you're somebody who really values like deep testing, please don't look at individual numbers that get posted. Like even this is just, of course, one AI test. But if you actually like try to be intellectually fair, even Apple's number, right, at 35 tops, is not really indicative of how much better it will perform. Apple themselves said that, for example, the 17% uplift in memory bandwidth will be felt through the neural engine because AI tasks really like bandwidth. Um, so who knows, right? Of course, the CPU is now more optimized for AI acceleration as well. If you look at Apple's actually like Core ML API and how the chip itself targets AI tasks, you will see that sometimes it's not just the neural engine working, it's the neural engine working together with the GPU, sometimes even simultaneously with the CPU. So there's actually a lot of interesting stuff happening, and it's just really, really difficult at this point to put it into one, like, oh, it's 35 tops number, right? And just as I said about that, also with the GPU, again, one benchmark never tells you the full story. Sometimes it will just be a rasterization test. If you go to a task like Blender, it might be so ray tracing based that it has absolutely nothing in common with the types of games you actually play on iOS or even macOS. So the truth is, I can like dumbly say like, oh, the truth is always somewhere in the middle, but quite honestly, the truth is just very nuanced. And sometimes there are very different stories to tell. The CPU is a lot less complicated. Now, I do understand that a lot of people will harp on that, like, oh, between like M3 and M4, the architecture jumped from which, by the way, if you want to know, the M3 would perform at about 3100 here, maybe closer to 3200 on the M3 Max, M3 Pro, but so still significantly behind M4. And people will say like, well, that's because scalable matrix extensions are like 115% faster. That, of course, impacts the chip. Some will say that improving clock speeds is somehow unfair, which is absolutely schizophrenic in my opinion. So whenever you saw results where the M4 might be actually getting close to 4000, which would actually be very interesting to see, for example, like let's say on an M4 Max, right, how that would look, and in that way it just completely outclasses anything on even like the highest clocks x86 chips, like the latest Zen 5 processors, the upcoming Intel Arrow Lake chips. Obviously, Lunar Lake is like a mobile architecture. That one isn't even designed to clock that high. So that would be very, very interesting to see, like the details. But yeah, to me, this idea of like SME doesn't count, whatever, ARM v9 versus ARM v8, that to me doesn't matter. Now, that's basically it for the exact thing that we see. It's obviously important to account for the fact that the exact core setup, right? A lot of people expected Apple to maybe jump to an 8-core CPU, maybe introduce like 2 additional efficiency cores the way they have done on the M4. So now we actually have this discrepancy where Apple gave the M4 more CPU cores than before, but on the A17 Pro, Apple gave the A series chips more GPU cores than before. So there's definitely a difficult balance here for Apple to just, they cannot lift up everything, like more silicon. Hey Siri, stop. I don't know why Siri decided to activate itself, but it did. My God, it was also so loud. I get like, what the F is happening? So of course, if you actually compare it to the M1, it's not just that it's faster in multi-core, it just completely outclasses it in single-core tasks. If you look at Android competition, now a lot of Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 chips will give you like 100 or something like that in multi-core scores, but those are usually like the extremely cool chips, and it's usually like when, for example, a Galaxy S24 Ultra hits such a high result, it just cannot sustain it. Like it's very noticeably like a one-time thing, and then it jumps to like 6700, 6800, and then of course in single core, still coming in below the results of an M1. of course, people will argue just how relevant that is, because obviously this might have like even faster storage or faster memory, which could benefit it in like responsiveness and things like that. But yeah, if you just look at raw tests, it's definitely behind. Daniel, what's the difference between tops and tokens? I saw that the 18 Pro has 35 tops and the Tensor G4 has 45 tokens. Those have nothing to do with each other. Tops basically means trillions of operations per second. Those things, like, well, it depends on what benchmark you run, but of course you have like your clock speed, which is like millions of rotations, quote unquote, that the chip can perform with more cores, potentially like even like more tasks on being handled on one core, which of course on the neural engine has like 16 cores. You can just run a lot of tasks at once and actually finish them. Of course, that's you cannot just say, oh, I'm running 35 tops. You actually have to finish them. And tokens is a measure of like how much you can actually generate of like very specific AI results. Those will usually be very much interconnected to like a very specific like algorithm or large language model, right? So I think I'll have to look up a good definition here. AI token. Usually I associate token with like coins, but that's not really correct, because obviously you can generate tokens just in general with any kind of LLM as a result. So maybe there is like that are using AI coins. The next, a token being usually a word, subword, or punctuation, right? So it's a specific result that gets generated as part of an AI task, but that specific result can be very different. And of course, it will vary a lot between individual large language models, while TOPS is somewhat similar to FLOPS, right, which is floating point operations per second, and how we have measured GPUs in teraflops. That is a much more generalized compute thing, where you can just say, oh, there are so and so many cores, they're clocked so and so high, and each core can perform so and so many tasks, right? But that obviously you can have a GPU that has exactly the same amount of cores, is clocked exactly the same way, but then you have like real world differences, like them using a completely different architecture. So while they technically have the same teraflops rating, they actually end up performing completely differently in real world. Then there's also stuff like memory bandwidth to consider, cache, things like that. And when we actually look at real world AI tasks, this is when we look at things like tokens. But again, a token will be based on the LLM you actually benchmark, quote unquote. So Google has like, of course, their like Gemini LLMs, however they call them. And it so happens that because Google wants to actually not just talk about their hardware, but also like their LLMs, they will bring up stuff like, oh, the Tensor G4 gives you so and so many tokens. It's comparable to such and such actual GPU, while Apple is much more interested in talking about their processor, and then their actual LLMs, they're much less the focal point for Apple. Like Apple wants their LLMs to just be part of iOS, right? They want you to think of it, oh, it's a thing that runs inside the Photos app, right? It's a thing that runs inside the Notes app. They don't really feel the need to say, oh, look, our LLM is so speed optimized. Here you can get like 50% more tokens after this test. No, they will just say like iOS has some performance and stability optimization optimizations, right? They usually don't want to attract that kind of audience that is really hyper fixated on things like tokens. Especially with also, as I said, like I, for example, associate tokens still with coins, because just like a token can be a word, subword, punctuation, whatever, a token can also be like a generated coin in a way. And Apple just wants to avoid all that stigma. This is why they don't even use that term AI that much. JB Ibrahim saying that chat saying, did you see that Gikaran uploaded a video today interviewing Johnny Cerrucci? Yeah, I actually haven't been able to watch it yet. I don't know if I can watch it. I don't know if there's any kind of demonetization associated with using their stuff. So, and Daniel, you're saying you like the Apple approach. Yeah, I do too. The only problem with the tops approach is, of course, as I've shown you here, right? Apple can, by doing a very rough like overview, like saying, oh, it's 16 cores, they're clocked at that and that clock speed, and each core can perform so and so many tasks simultaneously. So it's still 35 tops, because apparently Apple didn't change clock speeds from the A17 Pro to the A18 Pro. But when you actually look at real world benchmarks, right, especially the integer 8 score, which is quantized score on the Geekbench AI 1.1 test, like you get like almost 50% uplift. So that goes beyond like the 17% more memory bandwidth. That obviously goes beyond the same 35 tops rating. That goes beyond them saying, oh, it's a slightly like we gave the 18 Pro a little bit more cache. Like, yeah, it's there definitely are downsides to each and every one. If Apple really, really pushes their LLMs, for example, when you think about features like cleanup inside the Photos app in iOS 18, I would really like for Apple to say, like, cleanup now works 25% faster, right? That's technically very similar to the tokens rating that Google provides, right? Because you can technically say, well, the more tokens inside your LLM, the faster cleanup works. While that's true, I would argue that people would much more likely want to hear the exact benefits to a specific task that they perform in iOS than they would about tokens or even Terra Ops, right? I don't even like the tops rating anymore at all, because it's just misleading, as again this test shows. But yeah, I can understand why Apple still clings to it a little bit, because Apple was kind of even like the introducer of that with the neural engine inside, like first the A11 and then the much faster one in the A12. Nvidia still gives you the tops like that. They really brag about how great their scaling is from FP32, FP16, integer 8, even introducing like integer 4 capabilities inside their latest GPUs. So yeah, if you ask me, I think it's very, very hard to just quantize neural engine improvements in general, but I'm glad that my explanation helped a little bit. It's not a very precise explanation, because it's not something I've actually ever cared about going into too much detail, like verbally. So I guess I'll have to look it up in the future. So if somebody asks again, I'll actually have like a smoother explanation without even Googling anything. But thank you so much for asking. Yeah. That's about it, honestly, for the A18 Pro. I don't want to like stretch out the topic, because it's well, it's there. I know that a lot of you are really looking forward to a lot of benchmarks that we get across the spectrum. Again, you can see how it compares to something like the M3. Now, this is the M3 Max, so of course that one will have tremendously more multi-core higher multi-core results. If we actually go into overall benchmarks, I can show you just like top single core results. Yeah, this is all like a little unrealistic. Like, let me just give you the 14900 KS. You can see that this is about the highest that x86 reaches about you. Zen 5 gives you probably around 3500 as well. So the fact that Apple matches that, of course, on an A series processor is absolutely insane, because just the single core power consumption on the 4900KS is insane. And if you look at the 9700X, which isn't even like the fastest clocked Zen 5 chip, you can see where it gets close. What is it called? Is it the 9950X? That's the 16 core variant at up to 5.7 gigahertz, right? And this is where you can get like results that are closer to the M4, of course, which is clocked at like 4.4 gigahertz. So if the architecture is exactly the same between A18 Pro and M4, that explains, of course, why the M4 is faster. And of course, the A series chips are not designed to compete with the highest clocked, biggest x86 desktop chips. That kind of performance you won't see that, for example, from almost the same Zen 5 cores on something like the Strix Point APUs, because their like CPU architecture is actually a little bit less complex. Like, it doesn't give you full AVX 512 support, not the full bandwidth version of desktop Zen 5. So it's actually very interesting that we'll see a lot of like slight subvariants between like even like technically the same architectures. And of course, as I said about the GPU, we'll just have to wait for real world benchmarks. I think a lot of what will actually impact gaming performance on the A18 Pro is actually Apple giving you a lot better cooling inside the iPhone. Well, it crossed the entire iPhone 16 series, but especially inside the 16 Pro and 16 Pro Max. So that will, of course, potentially like be the difference between your display dimming or not. That will be the difference between like your clock speeds having to go down, creating instability, creating frame rate spikes. So that might actually be a bigger change to the overall user experience than just the A18 Pro. But of course, the A18 Pro in of itself is also more efficient than the A17 Pro. So while benchmarks for the GPU might be, if we actually look here, like 33,000 versus 27,000. So you have like 25% more, 21% to be precise here. I've seen some tests where it even goes slightly higher, I believe. But yeah, Apple promised like a 20% uplift in GPU performance, so I think that makes a lot of sense here. And then, of course, as I said, when we're talking about real architectural difference, like potentially much better handling of ray tracing, we'll see if it has like maybe a GPU architecture that has never been done before in any Apple device, or if it's actually like pretty much the same GPU architecture as in the M4. But again, that's because we don't yet quite know everything about the M4. It's not because the A18 is such a huge surprise. Yeah, and of course, people will just harp on and saying like, oh, Snapdragon 8 Gen 3, it was already like 30% faster and stuff like GFX Bench. That never translated to like real world results in actual games. So again, the real world scaling and the impact of better cooling is, in my opinion, where it will get really interesting. Of course, speaking of the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3, which we just talked about, with results like in the 2200 single core range and the, let's say, 7000 multi core range, there has been a leak, and it came, I believe, from Ice Universe over on Twitter. And ironically, it came on the same day as like the first A18 results. So you can argue if that is maybe a little bit like controlled like marketing and opposition stuff. But this one actually gives you a huge multi-core lead versus the A18 Pro with like 10,000 on the multi-core. If we actually go like 10 divided by 8.5, That's an 18% difference. So that's basically the difference that you get between the A17 Pro and the A18 Pro. So a generational jump of 18%. Now seemingly you can get that on the Snapdragon 8 Gen 4 right away. Now, of course, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 4 is still a little bit off, like a little bit away. Well, you can now currently already order A18 and A18 Pro devices. Now, I should just say, keep all of that with a big pinch of salt, because we have a single core result of 3236 that is more than 10% faster than some of the highest results for the Snapdragon X Elite. It's clocked higher than the Snapdragon X Elite. Now, the Snapdragon X Elite is a desktop chip, but it is a node behind, if you can even call it a full node, between N4P and N3E. It's not as big of a jump as, for example, if we would compare like first gen 5 nanometer to N3E, or even second generation 5 nanometer. This is basically 5 nanometer Gen 3.5. And yeah, this result, this I honestly don't believe. Don't get me wrong, I actually believe that it's possible to probably hit those numbers. For one, we've talked about how Apple has 6 cores on the A18 Pro, 2 performance cores and 2 efficiency cores. This chip has 8 cores, 2 performance cores at 4.32 gigahertz. Again, that is closer to the clock speed of the M4 than it is to the 4.05 gigahertz on the A18 Pro, which is absolutely insane. That just makes no sense to me when you consider this, what we saw in terms of power consumption from the Orion CPU cores on the Snapdragon X Elite, unless this is surprisingly like a brand new architecture, which I wouldn't believe, because this is still an ARM v8 chip, not an ARM v9. Like Snapdragon X Elite famously downgraded, actually, like because previous Qualcomm cores came with ARM v9 because they were much more like off-the-shelf solutions from ARM itself. Well, now it seems like it's actually, like, of course, still downgraded. So this is not Orion 2. At best, it's maybe like Orion 1.5. And yeah, the multi-core result would, of course, benefit from the fact that it's supposedly maybe using like 8 Orion cores, and those 6 cores are almost the same as the bigger cores, maybe like with less cache or something like that, but they're clocked lower. But even here, Apple's efficiency cores are like clocked at 3 gigahertz or something like that at most. A18 Pro clock speed efficiency, I actually haven't looked at that for the A18 Pro efficiency cores. For course, wow, so they are at 2200 megahertz, which is yeah, absolutely insane. By the way, like some people use like nano review stuff. It's decent for x86 results. It's complete garbage for mobile chips. So please don't use them. I have no idea how this website even works, because it's just like a chart aggregation site. Maybe it even uses like AI to actually find all that data. So it's not a really helpful thing. But yeah, definitely seems like there are massive clock speed differences. Those clock speed differences to me are so high. Not to say, of course, it makes sense that an Orion core would clock higher than Apple's efficiency focus cores, but the fact that they even clock like their performance cores like 8% faster, which again, the jump from N4P to N3E isn't really magic. Yes, this is the first time in a while where Apple basically shares one node with the latest TSMC chips, though you can argue that the A16 between N5P and N4, there really wasn't a big difference between Apple and what Qualcomm offered. But like, yeah, when it comes to like a really brand new node, this is the first time that Apple shares it with Qualcomm in quite a while. And yeah, just those clock speed differences to me like I wouldn't be surprised if this was technically possible, like as a reference device, maybe like in a tablet, but on a smartphone this just doesn't make sense. Like, why would you ever want this to clock above 3 gigahertz, like that high? Like, this would be just pointless power consumption, pointless heat generation, taking away potential bandwidth away from the actual performance cores. The performance cores, again, at 4.3 gigahertz, with Orion clocking at 4.2 and 4. Maybe it can clock that high on N3E, but given like the disproportional like efficiency loss that you get by going to higher clock speeds, I just don't believe that. Now, people have also said that, of course, the GPU uplift of the Snapdragon 8 Gen 4 will be very impressive. That being said, we don't yet have at least any good benchmarks for that. And I just want to remind people that a lot of the results for the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 pointed towards it having around 2,500 results in single core. That ended up being over 10% faster than most real world results. So if we actually applied that same metric, you will find that some of the older benchmarks that had leaked, where it resulted in single core results of around 2,900, putting it about in line with the results of the A17 Pro, and multi-core results somewhere closer to 9,000, like definitely over 8,000 though. Like, that makes a lot of sense. It just, like, considering that neither company has like a completely magical architecture. Like, yes, Apple's single core results are notorious for being great, but when it comes to multi-core scores, the scaling is usually pretty much in line with what you get from other ARM systems on similar nodes, of course. And given that Qualcomm definitely isn't introducing like some cutting edge ARM v9 based system here, yeah, so that will be very interesting. That being said, will also be another major competitor, which will be the X925 core, which is such a stupid name. X95 ARM clock speed, which has been rumored to be at like around 3.8 gigahertz. Some recent tests said it would be like 3.6 gigahertz, which would be quite interesting. And of course, that it would have a tremendous IPC uplift. So even though it doesn't clock as high as the Orion cores here, it might actually perform closer to the results of Apple's A18 cores. Again, it's all speculative yet. We'll have to wait for a month or two to see it all in full, but that's about what we're getting right now. Of course, Apple still has the very definitive advantage that they're launching devices right now. And while we'll see some Chinese devices this year coming with like the Snapdragon 8 Gen 4, and we'll see Samsung eventually maybe introducing like, and MediaTek's introducing chips based on the Cortex X925, that still leaves months for Apple to still be first on N3E, on the latest architecture in comparison to the rest. I fully accept A18 Pro to outperform like the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 in absolutely every way, except for maybe some obscure some super old GFX benchmarks. And then with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 4, that of course remains to be seen. That will be very interesting, probably much more competitive generation than we've had for a little while. So, and of course, I'll let you know once those devices actually come out, once those benchmarks actually come out. But I just, like, the one thing I just want to like focus on here, right, is like Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 reference. Reference benchmarks. So you can see reference benchmarks were over 2300. I believe I saw a lot of them in the in 2500 range, and then in the multi-core results 7500. Again, those results are possible in like overclocked versions and things like that, and 7500 is possible in versions that are just like very well cooled, like some gaming devices. But like, yeah, those are not the results that you will see, of course, from the likes of Samsung. And maybe Samsung goes crazy with the cooling system in the Galaxy S25 Ultra after delivering a somewhat disappointing solution with the Galaxy S24 Ultra. But again, it's all speculation. We'll have to see how real world results actually perform. The last thing here is actually like just me continually shitting on Google, which is like when you look at the Tensor G4. Nope, I cannot look up that way. Tensor G4, Geekbench. You'll see, of course, that these results, it's where it gets like really really embarrassing for Google. These results have nothing to do with flagship performance. Apple outperforming single core results by 50%. Multi-core results, we actually return to the calculator. It's 8500. Let's just be very generous here. Divide it even by 4700. It's 80% faster. So yeah, if you're Google, you're definitely, this is why when Daniel, you asked about like tokens, like Google is very much just willing to share AI results because in everything else, they just freaking suck right now. Yeah, that's about it for the chip analysis for the A18, A18 Pro. Right now, again, some of the competitive results that have launched, I believe, were like explicitly launched to like kill some of the excitement. I believe maybe some reference devices could hit that, but I would be very surprised to see like multi-core results significantly over 9,000 in the Snapdragon 8 Gen 4, maybe like 9,200 I could see happening with like very well-cooled devices. Single core results, again, I would be very surprised to see results significantly above 3,000. But of course, real world results will show. Now, I mentioned multiple times, of course, that real world results do not just benefit from a better, more efficient chip, but also from things like objectively better cooling. And one of those results that we have actually talked about in the past is, well, during the introduction of the iPhone 16 and 16 Plus, was the fact that they now support 25-watt wireless charging with the latest MagSafe accessories. And it seems like Apple has similarly upgraded their wired charging capabilities, going from 27 to 29 watts on the iPhone 15, 15 Pro, like 15 series. Well, technically, that I believe that charging speed is only reserved for the Pro Max even. So that uplift is even beyond 50%. But apparently, the entire iPhone 16 lineup supports up to 45-watt fast charging via its USB-C port. Now, this came from certifications shared by Shrimp Apple Pro, who is a pretty reliable source, but when it comes to just sharing certification, that's obviously much less like controversial as a leak. So that were details submitted to the China Quality Certification Center, posted to Weibo. They perform at 5 to 15 volts at 3 amps. If you know, of course, how watts are calculated, that will give you 45 watts. Some people have said that it will perform real world more to 39 watts, which does make sense to me, just given how charging curves work. Maybe there will be small difference between like the non-pro and the pro models, between the larger models and the smaller models. So if Apple doesn't want to fully commit to like 45 watts, that to me just makes a lot of sense. Being careful with what you promise is very good, but I would expect this, of course, to just like on Apple's website, they don't even talk about that much. So I would expect it just to be like, oh, you play a game, our chips now can suck more power simultaneously, right? even though it is more efficient, our better cooling system does allow us to give you higher sustained power consumption, and like our batteries are larger. So in that way, if you actually happen to have a faster charger, even if it's only a slightly faster charger, right, might not even be full 45 watts, or I would usually recommend like a 60-watt charger if you like really reliably want to reach like 45, 50 watts without like your charger getting absurdly hot. That to me just makes a lot of sense. Before Apple's iPhone 16 announcements, there were rumors that they would support 40 watts, which does again line up with what we heard from some of the most recent stuff, where the 45 watt like raw specification would actually result in like 39 watts charging. So that makes a lot of sense. And the reason why I'm mentioning this the way I am is because this directly connects to better cooling capabilities. Like, yes, maybe the actual battery technology is a little bit newer. Like, of course, we know the Pro models have like that metal casing on the battery. We know we know that the regular 16 models actually have some kind of new process that connects the battery to the device in a different way, so it's easier to replace. I don't know how much that benefits cooling or not. They've talked about how like they have a full recycled aluminum internal structure that gets connected to like the titanium sides on the Pro models. So it's much better at even like utilizing the internal metal, right? It doesn't just give you like 50% more aluminum insides or something like that, resulting in dramatically heavier devices. It also just much more smartly utilizes the metal that was already there in models like the 15 series, the 14 series, and so on. And part of better cooling for the chip will, especially if you make it a cooling system that spans the entire device, will inevitably also benefit the battery, because the battery, except for the chip, is also a huge source of heat generation. So Apple actually improving that makes a lot of sense. Of course, even the bigger benefit here is 25 watts MagSafe versus 15 watts. But I don't know how many people will buy like a faster charger and a new MagSafe cable. I think it's while most USB-C cables that you have already out there will pretty easily handle 45 watts, so you'll just need a charger, preferably in the 50-60 watt range. So very, very good news. I have always said I'm quite happy with the charging speed on like the current 15 Pro series, but going higher is just beneficial in my opinion, given just how much crazy like 100-watt charging speed some Chinese manufacturers are pushing. If Apple can give us 40 watts with like a good charging curve and without significant additional battery degradation, that to me just sounds really cool. And if you're somebody who like chooses to charge your device maybe with like an old 20-watt charger, that might have the benefit that your battery will degrade a lot slower, because there will be a lot less heat generation, and then you will just have longer battery health. So a lot of benefits, I believe, for everyone, regardless if you get the latest MagSafe accessories, regardless if you get even faster charging faster chargers, and hopefully the cables are good enough. Of course, Apple still ships a USB-C to Type-C cable. I believe that one is either 60 or 100 watt compliant. At least it was on the 15 Pro. So it will be interesting to see if maybe Apple made it even better on like the 16 Pro series. Beyond that, there are a lot of smaller stuff that keeps coming out about the exact specifications on the iPhone 16 and 16 Pro. I don't want to like go too much into it because before we have like actual like real world testing for any of those components. For example, there is the talk that the iPhone 16 batteries are much easier to replace to comply with EU law. As you know, they are mandated think that's starting soon, not yet this year though, that like smartphones should have very easily to replace, like manually replace batteries, so the devices actually last longer. And seemingly the base iPhone 16, not yet the 16 Pro and Pro Max, are following that design change. That actually reminds me of how the iPhone 14 introduced that new internal like design where you could open the device from both the front and back, while the 14 Pro series kept the old design that you could only open from one side. So it seems like Apple is actually like they're having like this trickle down approach to regular hardware, like, oh, first the pros get this chip, this camera, and then the next year the regular models get it. And on the regular models they're actually going with like a trickle up approach where, oh, in terms of repairability, we're like, oh, the base models actually get this more repair friendly feature this year, and then the pros get it next year, which is actually quite cool. So if you're somebody who really thinks, oh, the base models are pointless, right? Like, oh, they don't have promotion, which means they're absolutely worthless because you have like $300, like 90 or even 120 hertz Android devices. Just from a purely architectural perspective, like from an engineering effort perspective, Apple definitely is keeping up on both devices. And even things like, for example, that color infused glass, where it got a lot of criticism last year for having very, very subdued colors. Well, now this year, Apple is going like, yeah, here's our new color-infused glass, and it just looks absolutely amazing. Things like ceramic shield, of course, upgraded across both 16 and 16 Pro. So there's definitely still a lot of effort put across both 16 and 16 Pro, just because a specific feature you might want, or you might expect, given a specific price point, is not there on the base model, doesn't mean that Apple doesn't care about those base models. Yeah, so larger battery, better heat dissipation, and the battery service is easier to do. So that's definitely a lot of benefits. We've actually talked about the electrically induced adhesive debonding technology as a rumor quite a while ago for the iPhone 16 series. We don't yet know if that is what makes it easier to replace. So we'll have to wait for stuff like iFixit actual breakdowns before we make our final conclusion on that, how much easier it actually is. But it definitely seems like Apple is going a lot farther with repairability than even at this point some Android brands. I know, of course, with Android brands, it's like, you could argue it's very easy to find like replacement hardware that is very cheap. Apple usually like controls the supply of original parts, which makes repairs quite expensive, even if you do them yourselves. But at least when it comes to the actual process of DIY repairs, they seem to be getting easier and easier. Apple will also give you a tool to actually pair original parts, so that way what was previously like required like work from like an authorized repair center, now you can do at home, which of course will benefit a lot more people who want to do DIY but previously didn't think it would be worthwhile. Now it seems like Apple is going step by step into direction of improving that. I personally don't care about it that much, but I know some people do. I know some people like Louis Rossmann on YouTube are like big proponents of that, and I'm definitely not against it, right? I'm against repairability that makes my device of choice worse, right? Makes it thicker, heavier, reduces water resistance and stuff like that. But as long as Apple can maintain a great design, great waterproofing, things like that, and still gives us easier to repair devices, of course, I am all for that. The last component I want to talk about is actually the 5G modem. This one seems to specifically apply to the 16 Pro series because the regular 16 seem to be sticking with the same X70 modem as last year, and now the 16 Pro is getting the faster X75 modem. This was the rumor that was actually like like rumored for quite a while, but I started doubting it when I read that the both iPhone 16 and 16 Pro will have Wi-Fi 7. So I thought, oh, maybe then they also get all like better 5G modems, because for the longest times the rumors for the regular iPhone 16 said that it would only quote unquote only get Wi-Fi 6E from the iPhone 17, from the iPhone 15 Pro and 15 Pro Max. But interestingly enough, the 16 Pro, of course, gets definitely both the X75 faster modem and Wi-Fi 7. Still not fully sure about the regular 16, but about when it comes to what modem it uses, seems like it's still the X70 modem, but it hasn't yet been officially confirmed. However, from the test that we have gotten for the iPhone 16 Pro and its newer X75 modem, seems like it's performing about on what was promised, which is great, because sometimes you actually get a faster modem, but the actual like antenna isn't good enough and things like that, and so you don't even get the promised uplift. But this seems like it gives you 25% faster boost in 5G download speeds, with like an average of like 23.7%. Definitely a nice uplift. The biggest uplift coming if you're using Verizon, which makes sense. While Verizon is like a big partner for Apple, they're pretty much the only reason they're keeping like millimeter wave capabilities alive. But yeah, definitely seems like on like the latest networks with the latest modems, it performs really, really well. That being said, of course, some of the speeds here like it definitely seems like 5G in general just needs better modems, because whatever we see happening on like the carrier side, it just seems not very ambitious. Here in Germany, like in Berlin, the capital, I see like crazy spikes from between like 15 megabytes per second to like 300-400. Recently, the 5G around where I live get actually upgraded from like 200 to way over 300. So it's very, very inconsistent, very, very like position dependent. But the X75 modem doesn't just promise, of course, to be faster. It also promises to be more efficient, and it promises to have just in general more stable connectivity. So maybe that will be a big benefit to the 16 Pro and 16 Pro Max as well. That being said, that pretty much concludes what I have to tell you right now about the 16 and 16 Pro. We'll of course keep getting now, like in the next week, like reviews for all those devices. I'll have hopefully more to tell you about exact specifications, like what kind of main camera the 16 Pro and 16 Pro Max will use. Supposedly it's a newer sensor, just not larger, which is definitely better than it using the exact same sensor some of us have speculated, but it's worse than potentially using a newer and larger sensor. Yeah, so of course there will be accessories coming out. Unfortunately, as we all know, Apple kind of killed fine woven, so we'll see if any, like how good that, how much that benefits like leather accessory providers, because Apple hasn't actually brought back their own leather accessories. So you see, even from like something like 9to5Mac, right now we are just in the phase of actually waiting for reviews, hands-on impressions of devices that actually reach consumers, not just big reviewers like MKBHD or Mr. Who's the Boss. And I will be all there with you once that additional stuff comes out. As always, please let me know what you would like to see me cover next. I will either be doing a new stream tomorrow or on Saturday. I will let you know, of course, as always. And before we finish out, please do the YouTube jazz, as I call it. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, comment, share it out. And if you want to support this channel directly, please consider giving a small donation in the form of a super chat or a super sticker, or becoming a channel member right here on YouTube, or becoming a supporter over on Patreon. Thank you guys so much. I'll see you next time. This is Mark Tech tuning out.